The birth of a star. The story begins, not with fame, but with a pair of violet eyes that the world would never forget. Before she became the Queen of Hollywood, before the scandals and the diamonds, there was just a little girl with eyes that seemed to hold galaxies inside them. Elizabeth Rosamond Taylor was born in London in 1932 to American parents who had no idea that their daughter would one day dominate the silver screen. The world she entered was one teetering on the edge of war. Bombs would soon fall over Europe, and her family made the fateful decision to return to the United States. It was there, in California, that Elizabeth's destiny would begin to unfold. As a child, she carried a beauty that was almost unsettling. Her flawless skin, her dark lashes, framing those otherworldly violet eyes. People often whispered that she didn't look real, as if she had been painted by an artist rather than born. Hollywood, always hungry for something or someone that seemed larger than life, noticed. Her mother, a former stage actress, recognized the spark. Elizabeth was barely 10 years old when she first stepped onto a film set. She had no training, no preparation, only a presence that cameras seemed to adore. The studio executives saw what the world would soon see. She was not just a child actress, she was an emerging legend. Her breakout came with National Velvet in 1944. At only 12 years old, she carried the weight of the film with a maturity far beyond her years. Audiences were stunned. Critics praised her, and the industry quickly crowned her as the next great star. But behind the dazzling lights of MGM Studios, Elizabeth was still a child who longed for normalcy, something she would never truly know again. The film's success trapped her inside a golden cage. Hollywood adored her, but Elizabeth felt the invisible chains tightening around her. Childhood friends drifted away, replaced by endless rehearsals, strict studio contracts, and a carefully manufactured image. Every smile, every word, every gesture was sculpted by the machine of Hollywood. She was no longer just Elizabeth. She was Elizabeth Taylor. And yet, even in those early years, the whispers began. She's too beautiful. She will break hearts. That girl is dangerous. They weren't wrong, because Elizabeth Taylor was not destined to be just a movie star. She was destined to be a storm, a force that would shatter conventions, redefine love, and scandalize the world again and again. This was only the beginning. The rise of an icon, Hollywood was not a gentle place for children, and Elizabeth Taylor learned that lesson far too early. After National Velvet, the executives at MGM realized what they had on their hands, a rare jewel. They polished her, paraded her, and pushed her into the spotlight with a relentlessness that few could have survived. The studio system in the 1940s was a fortress built on contracts that bound young stars like property. Elizabeth was given etiquette lessons, speech training, even advice on how to walk, how to laugh, how to look at a man on camera. She belonged to the movies now, and the world belonged to her image. But unlike so many child actors who faded into obscurity, Elizabeth grew into her power. With every passing year, the girl with violet eyes became a woman whose beauty seemed almost unreal. The camera loved her, audiences adored her, and soon she was no longer just the sweet child from National Velvet. She was a star who could command the screen. In films like A Place in the Sun, 1951, opposite Montgomery Clift, Elizabeth began to show Hollywood something new. This wasn't just beauty. This was talent, raw, emotional, magnetic. She could break your heart with a single look, draw you into a scene without ever raising her voice. Her performances were more than acting, they were revelations. Yet fame is a double-edged sword. As Elizabeth's career soared, her personal life became a matter of public consumption. Gossip columns obsessed over her dates, her friends, her late-night outings. The studios encouraged the stories, knowing that every headline sold tickets. Elizabeth's name was not just in movie credits, it was on the front page of newspapers across America. But behind the glamour was a young woman trying to navigate adulthood under the weight of 1,000 flashing cameras. She longed for love, for authenticity, for something that wasn't scripted. At 19, she married for the first time to hotel heir Conrad Hilton Jr. The marriage was a spectacle, a Hollywood fairy tale, broadcast in magazines and radio reports. Yet within months, the dream collapsed. The marriage was turbulent, cruel, and ended in divorce. Elizabeth had entered a cycle that would define her life. Love found, love lost, and the world watching every moment. Still, she refused to be broken. With each personal failure, her on-screen presence grew stronger. She embodied glamour in a way no one else could. Diamonds, silk gowns, fur coats, these weren't costumes. They were extensions of her. She wasn't just Hollywood's darling anymore. She was Hollywood's queen in the making. And the world had only begun to see what Elizabeth Taylor was capable of. Love and heartbreaks. Love for Elizabeth Taylor was never quiet. It was fire. It was thunder. It was both intoxicating and destructive. And from her earliest marriages, the world began to understand that Elizabeth would never settle for ordinary. Her first marriage to Conrad Nicky Hilton Jr. had been celebrated like a royal wedding. Thousands of fans lined the streets. Newspapers covered every detail of the gown, the cake, the honeymoon. But what the cameras didn't capture was the nightmare behind closed doors. Nicky Hilton was volatile, abusive, and cruel. Elizabeth, barely 19, was trapped in a storm she could not control. Just 8 months later, she walked away, heartbroken and scarred, but unwilling to be a victim. Her second marriage to actor Michael Wilding seemed, at first, to offer stability. Michael was older, refined, gentle, a contrast to the chaos of her first husband. Together, they had 2 sons, and for a while, Elizabeth believed she had found something real. But Hollywood had other plans. Fame intruded on every corner of her life. Her beauty and magnetism drew attention that Michael struggled to accept. Jealousy grew. Distance followed. By 1957, the marriage had crumbled. Elizabeth's third husband, producer Mike Todd, was perhaps the first man who truly matched her fire. Larger than life, brash, and unapologetically ambitious, Todd adored Elizabeth with a passion that lit up the gossip columns. He showered her with jewels, whisked her away on adventures, and called her the most beautiful woman in the world. Elizabeth, for once, seemed blissfully happy. They had a daughter together, Liza, and for a fleeting moment, it looked as if Hollywood's most dazzling star had finally found peace. But fate, so often cruel in her story, had other plans. In 1958, Mike Todd's private plane crashed, killing him instantly. Elizabeth was devastated. The love that had filled her life with joy was ripped away in a single night. At just 26 years old, she was widowed, left to face the cameras, not as the glamorous queen of the screen, but as a grieving young woman whose heart had been shattered. It was in her grief that another scandal was born. Comforted by singer Eddie Fisher, the husband of America's sweetheart Debbie Reynolds, Elizabeth soon found herself at the center of Hollywood's most infamous love triangle. Newspapers branded her a home wrecker. Fans booed her at public appearances. She was vilified in a way few stars had ever been. But Elizabeth, fierce and unrepentant, did not back down. "You can't break up a happy marriage," she once said, in response to the scandal. It was a line that both shocked and defined her. Elizabeth was not just a woman swept up in love. She was a woman unafraid to claim it, no matter the cost. Her loves, her losses, her scandals, they weren't just side notes to her career. They were the story. Elizabeth Taylor was no longer just a movie star. She was a living, breathing epic, one where love was both her crown and her curse. And the world was watching, breathless, waiting for what she would do next. The Queen of Scandals. By the late 1950s, Elizabeth Taylor was no longer just an actress. She was a global obsession. Every dress she wore, every jewel she flaunted, every man she loved became front-page news. But with the death of Mike Todd and her sudden involvement with Eddie Fisher, Elizabeth crossed a line that even Hollywood's brightest stars rarely survived. America had adored Debbie Reynolds. She was America's sweetheart, the girl next door with a perfect smile and wholesome image. Eddie Fisher, her husband, was one of the most popular singers of the era. Together, they were a golden couple until Elizabeth stepped into the picture. Grieving the loss of Mike Todd, Elizabeth leaned on Eddie for comfort. At first, it was whispered as a friendship, but whispers grew into headlines. Soon, Eddie Fisher left Debbie for Elizabeth, igniting one of the most infamous scandals in Hollywood history. The backlash was merciless. Magazines branded Elizabeth a husband stealer. Churches condemned her. Fans hissed at her during public appearances. For the first time, the Queen of Hollywood was being portrayed as its villain. And yet, she refused to bow. Elizabeth did not apologize. She did not retreat into silence. Instead, she wore her defiance like a diamond tiara. "I am a survivor," she declared. "I'm not going to pretend to be something I'm not." It was a shocking declaration in an era when women, especially actresses, were expected to maintain spotless reputations. Her marriage to Eddie Fisher only fueled the spectacle. Photographers followed them everywhere, flashing bulbs, capturing every embrace, every stolen kiss. Hollywood had never seen such a public storm. But while the tabloids feasted on the scandal, Elizabeth's career only grew stronger. Ironically, the very scandal that threatened to ruin her only made her more compelling. Audiences could not look away. To some, she was a sinner. To others, she was a woman brave enough to live by her own rules. In truth, Elizabeth Taylor was both and neither. She was something entirely her own, a star who could not be contained by morality, by tradition, or even by scandal. But fate was not finished with her yet, because soon, on the set of a film so extravagant it nearly bankrupted Hollywood, Elizabeth Taylor would meet the man who would define not only her career, but her very legend. His name was Richard Burton. Burton and Taylor, Hollywood's storm. It was 1962 on the sprawling, chaotic set of Cleopatra, a film so ambitious it nearly drowned 20th Century Fox in debt. The budget soared to unheard-of levels. The production dragged on for years, and headlines branded it the most expensive disaster in Hollywood history. But what the world didn't know was that within that chaos, a love affair was igniting. One that would eclipse the movie itself. Elizabeth Taylor had already become a legend. The first actress to command a $1 million paycheck for a single role. She was Cleopatra, draped in gold, adorned with jewels, her violet eyes blazing with the power of a queen. And then Richard Burton walked onto the set. A Shakespearean actor with a voice like thunder, Burton was magnetic, intense, and dangerously charming. From their very first scenes together, the electricity was undeniable. The way he looked at her wasn't acting. The way she responded wasn't scripted. Cameras rolled. But what unfolded was more than cinema. It was the birth of one of the most scandalous and passionate love affairs in history. The problem? They were both married. Elizabeth to Eddie Fisher, Burton to Sybil Williams. And in an era when Hollywood still tried to preserve illusions of morality, their affair was nothing short of explosive. Paparazzi captured stolen glances, whispered conversations, and eventually heated embraces. Newspapers erupted. The Vatican itself condemned the affair as erotic vagrancy. For Elizabeth and Richard, it only fueled the fire. They fought, they drank, they loved with a ferocity that terrified and fascinated those around them. One moment, they were locked in screaming arguments. The next, they were inseparable, unable to keep their hands or their hearts apart. We lived entirely for each other, Elizabeth would later admit. We drank too much, fought too much, loved too much. Their marriage in 1964 was as grand as their affair had been scandalous. Together, they became the most famous couple in the world, Liz and Dick. They traveled with entourages, dripping in diamonds, living lives of staggering luxury. Richard gifted Elizabeth the legendary 69-carat Taylor Burton diamond, a stone as audacious as their love. But passion of that magnitude burns dangerously hot. Their fights were as legendary as their reconciliations. Friends described dinners where wine glasses shattered, voices thundered, and then, moments later, they were laughing, wrapped in each other's arms. Theirs was not a love built on peace. It was a love built on fire. For a decade, they were Hollywood's storm. They acted in films together. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? Among them, a masterpiece that blurred the lines between performance and reality. Elizabeth's searing portrayal of Martha earned her a second Academy Award. Many whispered that she wasn't acting, that she was simply living her own turbulent marriage on screen. But storms, no matter how fierce, eventually break. In 1974, Elizabeth and Richard divorced, exhausted by their own intensity. And yet, the story didn't end there. A year later, they remarried, only to divorce again in 1976. Theirs was not a fairy tale. It was something rawer, something far more human. It was love in its most dangerous, intoxicating form. And though their marriage could not survive, their bond never truly broke. Until the end of their lives, they remained tied to each other in ways no scandal, no divorce papers, no new lovers could erase. Elizabeth Taylor had lived through fire, and she had walked away, not destroyed, but forged into steel. And still, the world could not look away. Cleopatra and the immortal fame. Hollywood had seen spectacular productions before, but nothing, absolutely nothing, could compare to Cleopatra. When Elizabeth Taylor was cast as the Egyptian queen, she didn't just take on a role, she took on history itself. The film was plagued with chaos, ballooning costs, constant delays, lavish sets that swallowed entire sound stages. At $44 million, it became the most expensive film ever made, an amount so staggering that it nearly bankrupted 20th Century Fox. And yet, none of that mattered the moment Elizabeth Taylor stepped on screen. Draped in shimmering gold, her violet eyes lined in coal, she wasn't simply playing Cleopatra, she was Cleopatra. Regal, commanding, devastatingly beautiful. The camera didn't just capture her, it surrendered to her. Audiences around the world were mesmerized. Critics may have debated the film's flaws, but there was no debate about Elizabeth. She had transcended Hollywood. She was no longer just an actress. She was a goddess of the screen. But with that glory came scandal. Behind the scenes, her affair with Richard Burton was now front-page news. Every kiss on set was magnified, every whisper magnified into headlines. The film, meant to be a historical epic, had transformed into something else entirely, a mirror of Elizabeth's own life, where love, scandal, and power collided in ways even the screen couldn't contain. The Vatican condemned her. Conservative America scorned her. But Elizabeth didn't crumble under the weight of judgment. She leaned into it. "I've been accused of everything," she once said, "and I'm guilty of most of it." With those words, she turned scandal into power. She wasn't just surviving the fury, she was thriving in it. And Hollywood, despite its moral panic, couldn't let her go. Elizabeth Taylor was money. She was headlines. She was cinema itself. Cleopatra became one of the most watched spectacles of its time, and Elizabeth emerged not just richer in fame, but in fortune. She had become the first actress in history to earn $1 million paycheck for a single film, a figure that cemented her as both star and mogul. But beyond the numbers, beyond the glittering gowns and priceless jewels, something deeper was happening. Elizabeth Taylor had become a symbol of transformation. She wasn't afraid to fail publicly, to fall in love recklessly, to live out loud in a world that wanted women silent. And in that, she wasn't just Hollywood's queen. She was something rarer, an immortal. Still, for all the diamonds, all the glory, Elizabeth's life was far from a fairy tale. The years ahead would test her body, her spirit, and her will to survive, because even queens must face their battles. Illness, struggles, and a queen's redemption. By the 1970s, Elizabeth Taylor had lived a lifetime of passions, scandals, and cinematic triumphs. She had conquered Hollywood, defied the Vatican, and married the love of her life twice. But now, the battles she faced were no longer on the front pages of newspapers. They were within her own body and soul. For years, Elizabeth had fought pain. The glamorous gowns and glittering diamonds hid a truth few could see. Her health was fragile. Chronic back problems, illnesses, and the toll of years spent under intense lights and even more intense scrutiny began to weigh heavily on her. Add to that the endless cycle of champagne toasts, late-night parties, and the numbing comforts of alcohol and pills, Elizabeth was at war with herself. Her struggles became public. The woman who once commanded the screen with flawless poise was now captured in unflattering headlines. Taylor too drunk to stand. Liz battles addiction. The Queen has fallen. Paparazzi thrived on her decline, the same way they once glorified her rise. And yet, Elizabeth Taylor was not a woman who surrendered easily. For every fall, she found the strength to rise again. In the 1980s, as the world faced a terrifying new crisis, the AIDS epidemic, Elizabeth stepped into a role no one expected. She had lost close friends in Hollywood to the disease, and she was furious at the silence, the shame, the indifference that surrounded it. While many stars remained quiet, afraid to damage their image, Elizabeth roared. She co-founded the American Foundation for AIDS Research, AMFA, and became one of the most visible advocates for compassion, funding, and awareness. This was a new Elizabeth Taylor. No longer just the actress, no longer just the scandalous queen. She was now a warrior for health, for dignity, for the forgotten. Her activism reshaped her image. The woman once condemned as a sinner now stood as a savior in the eyes of many. She raised millions for AIDS research, visited patients, and lent her voice when silence was safer. The diamonds she once flaunted became symbols of auctions and charity galas, transformed from indulgence into instruments of healing. Elizabeth had always been larger than life, but now her greatness lay not in her beauty or fame, but in her courage. Even as her body weakened, her spirit blazed. She laughed loudly, loved fiercely, and fought tirelessly. "I've been through it all, baby," she once said, with that unshakable sparkle in her eye. "I'm Mother Courage." Elizabeth Taylor had been Hollywood's queen, Hollywood's scandal, and Hollywood's survivor. And now, she had become something far greater, Hollywood's conscience. The Eternal Queen. By the time the curtain began to fall on Elizabeth Taylor's life, she was no longer just a movie star, no longer just a scandal, no longer even just a survivor. She was an institution, a symbol of everything Hollywood could be: dazzling, destructive, beautiful, and heartbreaking. In her later years, Elizabeth's body carried the scars of her battles. She endured more than 30 surgeries, survived near-death experiences, and fought chronic pain with the same stubbornness she had once brought to the screen. The woman who had once been draped in furs and diamonds now often appeared in wheelchairs, her frame fragile, but her spirit unshaken. And still, when she entered a room, she was a queen. Her violet eyes had dimmed with age, but they had not lost their fire. There was wisdom in them now, a quiet defiance. The same eyes that once captivated audiences in National Velvet now carried the weight of decades of love and loss, of glory and grief. Elizabeth never stopped laughing. Friends recalled her wicked humor, her ability to turn tragedy into a story, scandal into a joke. She adored her children, her grandchildren, and her countless friends, many of whom owed their survival, literally, to her relentless AIDS advocacy. Even in her final years, she continued to raise millions, fighting not for her own legacy, but for the lives of others. And then, on March 23, 2011, the world finally lost her. Elizabeth Taylor passed away at the age of 79, surrounded by her children. Hollywood wept. Fans laid flowers at her star on the Walk of Fame. Newspapers across the globe carried her image one last time, framed not by scandal, but by reverence. But Elizabeth Taylor was never meant to simply die. Her presence lingers in the shimmer of a diamond, in the defiance of a woman who dares to love boldly, in the resilience of those who refuse to be silenced. She taught the world that beauty is not perfection, it is survival. That love is not safe, it is fire. That fame is not glamour, it is sacrifice. Elizabeth Taylor was more than an actress, more than a star. She was a force of nature, and though her body rests, her legend does not. In every reel of film, in every charity gala, in every whispered story of Hollywood's golden age, she remains eternal, the Queen. These stories are not just about the past, they are about your memories too. If you want to walk this journey with us, if you want to keep the legends alive, subscribe now.